Now, I'm going to dodge talking about the entire psalm. It's too hard. But I just want to concentrate on the first verse of it, where it says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and their ways are vile, and there is no one who does good." After about 850 games of umpiring football, I've been called an idiot many, many times. And I remember going to the optometrist and getting contact lenses, and the number of times I was called an idiot decreased from that moment on. But an idiot, I don't mind being called an idiot, but it's different to be called a fool. An idiot is sort of saying that this guy doesn't have full cognitive ability. But a fool can be smart, a fool can be educated, but can still say there is no God. A fool can do things without understanding the long-term consequences. The fool doesn't think in terms of a legacy. A fool looks for immediate gratification. And one of the most foolish things I read this week, we saw the invasion of the Capitol Hill in Washington, and we were dismayed when we saw that happen. But some fools are saying it was organised by the Democrats so that they could rubbish the Republicans. That would have been one of the most foolish things I've read all week. God looks down from heaven. This is verse 2 and 3. God looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, many who seek God. Everyone has turned away. All have become corrupt. There is no one that does good, not even one. So it's pretty miserable. And when we look at the Bible, when we look particularly at Proverbs, we find that we get a whole gamut as to who is a fool. Listen to some of these verses. "Whoever utters slander is a fool," 10:18. 10:23. "Doing wrong is like sport to the fool." 12:23. "The mind of a fool broadcasts folly." Or 15:5. Listen to this, young guys. "A fool despises a parent's instruction." Every fool, 10:20 verse 3, is quick to quarrel. "Crush a fool," 27:22, "in a mortar with a pestle, with crushed grain, but the folly will not be driven out." What does this verse mean? The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Is it talking to the atheist and the agnostic? The people who just don't believe in God at all? And let me tell you, that has changed incredibly over the last 40 or 50 years. You go back to 1960 and 1% of Australians did not believe in God. When we come up to the latest census in 2016, we discover that it's 30%, 1% 40, 50 years ago, to 30% who do not believe in God. And if that's pretty bad, go to England where it's 70%. If that's pretty bad, go to China where it's 90% of the population doesn't believe in God. And when you analyse those figures, you discover that the male who is educated and who is young is more or less likely to believe in God. And you ask yourself the question, why is it? Well, we've seen a tremendous change in technology. It's had something to do with it. We know more about the brain and the things that we used to attribute to God. Now the scientists can analyse what is happening in the brain. And has that meant that God has got smaller and smaller? Or are people disillusioned with the church? Sometimes people get hurt in church, they leave and they no longer believe in God, and I've got some minister mates who have done that. Or there are people who look at the behaviour of the church and they see all the child abuse and things like that. They don't believe in God because of that. Do you know, the number one reason why people do not believe in God is because of suffering that occurs in the world. They look at the epidemic, the pandemic that's going on at the moment, and they say, how can God cause this? They look at the Holocaust, which happened during the 1940s, and they say, how can God allow that to happen? And if we get time this year, we might look at the issue of suffering and whether we can still believe in God because of the pain that occurs. And it's interesting too, how the people who do not believe in God have changed. It used to be that I'm an agnostic and I'm an atheist and I keep my beliefs to myself and I don't interfere with Christianity and so on. Today it has become much more militant. And people today are organising rallies, they are writing books why we shouldn't believe in God. They are getting together and sometimes organising a combined force to prevent RI in schools and things like that. And it has become much more militant. And as Christians, we become a bit defensive. We say, well, we want to argue for the existence of God. And we talk about creation and how God is great. But the same people can go down the beach and the Christian can see the glories of God's creation. The fisherman sees the tides. The surfer sees which way the wind's blowing as far as things are concerned. The painter sees a picture that he can paint. And people see different things. And I don't think, even though I'm a great believer in creation, that creation would lead me to a belief in God. The main reason, and I've been asked this recently, the main reason why I believe in God is because of Jesus Christ. And I believe that he said who he was, and I believe what he said, and I take it on board. And to me, as I've often said from the pulpit, he is the greatest revelation as to what God is like. And that's a faith step. For me to step back and see Jesus Christ, who walked our planet 2,000 years ago, and say, I believe in this man, is a faith step. And let me also say that the agnostic or the atheist who takes a step back and looks at Jesus Christ and says, I don't believe in him. I believe he existed, but I believe he might have been a good prophet or a good man, but I don't believe that he's the Son of God. Either way, a faith step is involved. And when the atheist says he doesn't believe in God, he's taking a similar faith step to what I'm taking. When I say my whole being, my whole belief is centered on Jesus Christ. So, having said that, this verse we're looking at today has got nothing to do with atheism. Atheists didn't exist in the time of the Bible. And in fact, the Hebrew word doesn't have a exact equivalent of atheism. What it is saying, that everybody believed in a God or gods or supernatural beings. Atheism didn't exist, and it wasn't an issue for the Bible. What the verse is saying, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. What he's saying is the indifference to God. When we leave God out of our planet and our ethics and our immorality or morality, and we see him up there but not down here, when we put God in the ho-hum file, that is when we are being foolish. When we have an inadequate concept of God, that is being a fool. And some people are foolish in the way they confine God to certain areas. Do you remember that passage in Jacob, in Genesis, where Jacob is walking along and goes to sleep and he has a dream and he sees God and the angels are ascending up and down the steps. And in the morning he wakes up from his sleep and he said, surely the Lord was in this place and I was not aware of it. That's what happens. He didn't realise that his God was a universal God. He thought that God was just confined to the place where he lived. And the Bible, Hebrew Bible, explains to us that we're very slow to understand the universality of God. I know that the creation stories are at the beginning of the Bible, but they weren't at the beginning of the Hebrew thought. Now, we strike this quite a bit. I mentioned to you once before that I was in the United States on the Day of Independence and worshipped with a congregation in San Diego. And people were singing songs like America the Beautiful, Blessed by God, and all this type of thing. And you got the impression that the United States thought that they were a godly nation, perhaps the only godly nation. Or if you've seen the film Cromwell, and there Cromwell is marching off to war, leading his soldiers off to war, and the royalists are coming from a different direction. And there on the mountain, there is a priest praying that God would bless the battle for the royalists. And on another mountain, there is a minister praying that God would bless the battle for the Puritans. And they confined God to their tribe, their way of thinking. And they didn't understand that God was a universal God. And we can do exactly the same thing. We can think that God is here this morning, but when we go back to home and we get involved in mowing the lawns or switching on the computer or anything like that, we've moved into a secular world and we don't believe that God is involved. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool also doesn't understand that our God is a holy God, a righteous God. And sometimes we believe that God is not interested in the way of our lives. He's not interested in morality. And the Hebrews didn't always understand that. Sure, they had the law, but they often disobeyed it. And sure, they believed they were chosen from God, but often they mixed with other religions. Syncretism was strife. And they started to separate their feelings and their morality from the law. And this is what Isaiah had to say to them. Isaiah 1. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove your evil from mine eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, plead the widow. You see, what I'm saying is the fool doesn't behave like a godly person. The fool ignores if you like, the morality that we're supposed to exist. And what we see with Jesus Christ, he takes the morality to a higher level. You've got the law, you shall not do this, you shall not do that. But Jesus Christ, you read through the Sermon on the Mount, and you'll see him saying, it's not just what you do, but it's the way that you think. And when we do not allow God to influence our behaviour, we are being foolish.